All right, look, lovely to be here with you this afternoon, together with my son Daniel, who was my driver actually, so that's great. So he's just about onto his P's, just got to get those last final hours up, so that's a good incentive. Now, great to see many of you again. I met some of you when I was here some months ago. Liliana, she organised a health morning on a Sunday morning, and we had a great time where we spoke about some health issues, because health is really one of those things that is of interest to all of us. And I guess some of you who are still young, I can see some very young people, you may not think a lot about your health yet, but one day you will. And so when the church runs some health things, look, do be interested in it, because, look, it will make a big difference as you get into middle age and then older age. Now, also good to see Gavin and Zlata. Look, it brings back memories from Park Ridge at 1997 to the year 2000. Makes me sound old. I guess it makes them sound old as well. But we were together at that church for that period of time. And look, I've got very good memories from then as well. Now, what I've been asked to speak about, and Adam, thank you for your invitation, is the whole question of God. Now, you may wonder why we would want to even talk about the question of God. Isn't it assumed that, God exists and, here we are, we're, involved with a local church that's a Christian church that, believes in Jesus Christ, obviously believes in God as well. But you know what? More and more people don't believe in God. So, you guys are a fantastic community here. But you know what? Many of your work colleagues, many of your school friends, if you're studying at university, it's assumed by many that God doesn't exist. So it's one thing to be sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, and we want to do that. But at the same time, if people are questioning whether God exists at all, well, that can be a bit of a problem and a bit of a barrier. See, when we're in mainstream secular education, be it at school or be it at university, it is assumed that God doesn't exist. So all of our studies are done with that. So if someone is saying, well, God does exist, that's actually a foreign concept. So you look at the discipline of science. Within science, everything is done with the assumption that there is no God, that the physical is all there is, and there's nothing beyond the universe. There is no supernatural, there is no God. Also, when we look at disciplines like history or psychology, philosophy, etc., these assume that there is no God. So it can make it difficult as believers. Not only sometimes ourselves, we're challenged, as young people we're challenged, but also if we try to speak with some of our friends or colleagues, these are questions they ask. They say, well, hang on, what you're saying might be interesting, but hey, this is not what I was taught when I was at school, or even if I'm still at school. You might remember last year there was a census that most of us had to do. And a few months ago, they released those results. Now, it was actually quite frightening when you look at the state of the Christian church in this country. The numbers had gone down by over 1 million, even though the population had gone up over 2 million. In fact, the total number had gone down to 44% of the Australian population. The no-religion numbers had increased by 40% in only 5 years, up to about 37 or 38%. So the way that it's looking, if the current trends are to continue, the no-religion will be more than the Christian numbers at the next census in 5 years' time. Now, that's pretty scary, but also it's quite sobering. Now, look, for those of you who grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you might remember that, look, in those days it was 60, 70%, even higher percentage of the population identified as Christian. So it seems like society is certainly changing. But there's another frightening statistic which came out from a survey last year. It wasn't the census, but it was the Australian Community Survey. And amongst other questions, they asked a question about Jesus Christ. Who do you think Jesus Christ was? Not just who, but rather, did he exist? Was he a real person of history? 29% said that they didn't believe that Jesus actually existed, but he was a fiction, he was a myth. 22% said they didn't know. And 49% only said that they believed or thought that Jesus was a real person of history. Now that tells us that just under half of the population only think that Jesus actually existed. 51% say he either didn't exist or they don't know. Now, let's put those two different surveys or census figures together. Now, let's assume that the 44% who identify as Christian actually believe that Jesus existed. Now, that's probably a reasonable assumption. You'd think that most of Christians would believe that Jesus actually existed. I would hope so. Now, let's compare that with the other figure. Now, if only 49% actually believe he existed, that means there's only 5% above that 44% who actually believe that Jesus existed. Or put another way, only 5% of the remaining 56% actually believe that Jesus exists or existed. Now, that means 1 in 11 of non-Christians believe Jesus exists, or put another way, 10 out of 11 people in Australia who are not Christian have questions or don't believe that Jesus actually existed. You can see now for the first time in Australia's cultural history, there is a major issue with Christianity and people who are actually looking at who Jesus Christ is. So I hope I've highlighted the fact that, we've got a major issue here, not only in terms of existence of God, but in terms of people even believing that Jesus was a real person in history. Now, I can quickly add and say that when it comes to the evidence for Jesus in history, it is overwhelming. There is no serious academic scholar in the world today who will deny that Jesus actually existed. This was something that came out in an article that John Dixon, one of the foremost Christian scholars in Australia, he wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald, and this would have been syndicated through the country at the end of last year. And he was arguing, he said, look, there is no scholar in the world in the area of ancient history who would deny that Jesus Christ actually existed. So the academics say there's no problem, the historians say there's no problem, but it's amazing that 51% of the Australian population have their doubts. It's not based on the evidence, it's based on, I guess, their ignorance of history. And this is what we're finding, that more and more in this country there's an ignorance of Jesus Christ, there's an ignorance of what Jesus taught, of the Christian faith, and indeed people have forgotten God and in fact ignore God as well. Now, what does the mainstream narrative say? Now, some of you may have seen, just in the last couple of years, there was a pseudo-documentary, it's called. It's called Time Lapse of the Future. You can see it on YouTube. I don't know if anyone's seen it. But it was a half-hour documentary saying, what is the future of this earth and what is the future of the universe? And so it had various narrators, well-known people like Sir David Attenborough, the famous naturalist. There was Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, the world-famous physicist. There was Lawrence Krauss, who was another very famous physicist. And so these guys were narrators as well as many others, and they were putting forward what was the main view of science about the future of this earth and the future of the universe. And you know what? It actually was very depressing, because it showed a picture where the earth became more and more unstable, there'd be more and more natural disasters and catastrophes, such that the earth would not ultimately be able to support life, that the sun would expand, it would destroy the earth, and ultimately the sun would be destroyed, and then all the stars in the galaxies, they would all run out of energy, they would all be destroyed, and the universe would eventually run out of energy, and it would be an eternal nothingness. The whole idea is that the universe would run out of steam, would run out of power, would run out of energy, and eventually there would be no life possible and the universe would exist forever in a state of nothingness. I don't know about you, that doesn't fill me with a great deal of excitement. In fact, this YouTube has had over 85 million views, many thousands of comments, as you can imagine, and quite a number of them were actually kind of scary, saying, well, this is frightening, this is worse than a horror movie. And people are questioning the value of their lives. If everything ultimately becomes meaningless, well, what is the purpose of what I'm doing? And I think, taken to a logical extension, this is where, if we look at what mainstream science is telling us, apart from God, there is a very pessimistic future. On the other hand, we've got Jesus Christ, who was a real person of history, who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, who not only lived and died, was buried, and was resurrected. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have the Apostle Paul saying, and I tell you this, of first importance. And he says exactly this, of first importance is that Jesus, he died, he was buried, he rose from the dead, and he was seen by many people after he rose from the dead. And so this is what the Apostle Paul did. He preached this message, and you'll see in the book of Acts, the early Christian church preached this message, the message of Jesus Christ. Why? Because of this, because Jesus himself said, I am the resurrection and the life. And so we're told in 1 Corinthians 6 that because God raised him from the dead, we will be raised also. See, for those who believe in Jesus Christ, there is a guarantee that death is not the end. There is not a universe we're going to be in that's going to run down until there is nothing left. But rather, we have a God who loves us so much that he even didn't spare his own son to die for us so that we can have an opportunity to accept Jesus and live forever. Not to die forever, but to live forever, to be resurrected. So when there are loved ones we may have lost, it means death is not the end, but it means that there is a time that we will see our loved ones again. Now, I've got to say, look, I don't know about you, but I look at the contrast between the two. On the one hand, we've got mainstream science, which is a dominant narrative in our schools and universities, telling us that when we're dead, the universe, the physical is all there is, and there is nothing beyond, and it's all going to run down into nothing. Or we have Jesus Christ, who tells us that I am the way, the truth, and the life. Believe in me, and you can be resurrected again, and you can live forever. I mean, to me it seems that the Christian church has a message that is unbelievably good and positive, and everybody needs to hear. So if we've ever got any doubt about the fact that, what are we doing here? Do we have a message that's worthwhile saying or not what we're saying? I'd say you just look at that contrast. We've got something that is vital, something that is exciting, something that we can enthusiastically share. But then I come back to, I guess, a different question. And that is, and people might be asking the questions, and if anyone's skeptical, they're obviously asking the question. Well, this is fantastic. In terms of a story, the Christian story is very attractive. Surely everyone would want to believe it's true. But is it true? Is there evidence? Is there evidence? Is there good evidence? Is there convincing evidence that God actually exists? That there is a loving God, that there is a God as the Bible portrays. Because it's one thing to want to believe, but there's no point believing a fiction. You want to believe something that's real. So the question is there evidence that God, the God of the Bible, is real? And this is where, I could stand up here and I could keep talking, but I think it's important to turn that over to you guys. And that's why we'll have a roving microphone in a moment. Because what I want to do in the next, say, 5 to 10 minutes is brainstorm, and then we'll try to talk through them and try to unpack the ideas. But your views, your ideas, what are the good reasons that we can present and convincing reasons why we can believe that God is real? And on the other hand, what are some of the reasons or arguments that critics would use to say that God is not real? So what I want to do is to come up with maybe half a dozen or so on each side. So, reasons why we can believe that God is real and reasons why people would argue maybe God is not real. So let's open it up. If we've got, have we got a roving microphone? Or maybe I took the roving microphone, did I? So anyway, while they're getting the next microphone together, well, the other thing is, take this one and I'll just stand behind here. That might be easier. Oh, you're just about ready. So have a think of those, and what we'll do then, we'll brainstorm those, and hopefully they'll go up on the screen, so we'll be able to see them.
Hello?
Great, it works.
So since I've got the microphone, I can ask the first edition. Or Branko, if you want to put up the Word document as well, so we can put it up. I've got one for and against, and just the Bible, whether or not the Bible... Yeah, it is the evidence.
The Bible will be part of it.
But can you trust it?
It's broader in the one sense. We're looking at God. Look, particularly I'm looking at a Christian God, the God of the Bible, but it can be God generally. So what are some of the arguments or reasons that we can find convincing, that we can share with others as well, who may have doubts about it? And what are some of the objections people might have that we would need to address? So let's brainstorm some of those, and then we'll see if we can unpack them further. Please.
That's very loud. 4, I was going to put the incredible complexity of the human body and how each individual, everything needs to be there for you to function.
Fantastic. Yeah, love it. So the way I'd summarise that, complexity of the human body, and I would even put in brackets a design, because if sometimes we can use the bigger term, because design will deal with the human body, but people will talk about design in other parts of nature. But I agree with you. I think the human body, fantastic one. Thank you.
So 4, I'll say life.
Okay. So
how does life come from nothing?
Yeah, okay. So the origin of life.
Yes, exactly.
Love it.
So,
thank you.
Four, I would say nature, what we see in nature, like what we see outside.
Okay, so in other words, just I guess the nature and the way that it interacts. I mean, I guess you can talk about ecology, the way things sort of have to work together, otherwise it all becomes unbalanced.
Yeah.
But also, I guess you're also saying, and a little bit like, why is it even there? Where did it come from? And how complex it is and designed it is. Thank you.
Against, most people say, if everything was created by God, who created God?
Okay, all right, good. Yeah, no, it's a good question. Okay, so we've got a 4 is Bible prophecy. Fantastic. Yeah, good.
For against, if God exists, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world?
Okay, okay. So pain, suffering, evil, yep.
Like only life gives life, and only a like gives a like. So the dog is always dog.
Okay. So yeah. I think
what evolution teaches is opposite. It's
So in other words, how do you get increasing complexity, and how do you get diversity?
Diversity, yes.
Okay, diversity. And complexity too. So how? Yeah.
God created everything after its kind.
Yeah.
And it's like a like gives life to a like.
Yeah. So in other words, how can you possibly have one kind then giving birth to another kind and evolving into something else? So in other words, boundaries within, I guess, kinds or biological systems. Thanks. Yeah?
If we can prove that Jesus existed, then I think we can prove that God exists, because, I mean, according to my knowledge, there was no other man, if you will, who had so much power and did miracles and resurrected. So if he existed, if we can prove that he existed, that's a good enough reason for me.
Okay, good. So what I'd put there is the identity and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So you've actually got 2 arguments in one there. I like them. And look, maybe we just have one more, I've got to say, because I'm looking at we've got to unpack all of these yet.
I was just going to say historical evidence that backs up what the Bible says.
Okay, so, all right, in terms of...
like archaeology, that type of thing.
Okay, so evidence for the Bible. Okay, evidence for the Bible, fantastic. All right, good. Oh, look, I think you guys have come up with a really good list there. Look, and you've got, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is that 7? 7 for and 2 against. All right. Okay, well, look, because what I want to do then is to spend a little bit of time going through, we'll try to address each one of them. So that'd be good. I always like to start with maybe the against, deal with the objections, and then we can really hone into the fors and finish, I think, on a very good note. So, look, when it comes with against, the first one there is who created God. Because some people, and you hear people ask that question, well, look, because we have a law of cause and effect. And so, we think that for everything that we see, there must have been some sort of cause to make it come into being. I mean, that's what is believed in science. In science, it's believed that the universe had a beginning, and so it came into existence. So I'm going to actually look at that one and look at it in 2 different ways. So let's have a look at, the question of the origin of the universe. So, and I would argue this as an argument for God, and then we'll come back to the God question. So when it comes to a universe coming to existence, it either comes from nothing or it comes from some power that needs an intelligence that brings it into existence, assuming that it had a beginning. About 100 years ago, there were a lot of scientists who believed that the matter was eternal. And so there was always something there, and then it just developed and evolved. The problem with that is most scientists don't believe that. In fact, that's very much out of favour. And it still begs the question, where did that something come from? I mean, how was it always existing just as matter? So then you come down to, unless you accept that everything is an illusion, and that's hardly satisfactory, then you've got two choices left. You've either got a universe from nothing, or you've got a universe that came because of an intelligent mind. So what about this idea of a universe from nothing? Well, not only is it counterintuitive, it doesn't make sense with any of the laws of physics we have today, but the best minds within evolution don't have an answer to it. About 10 years ago, there was a book that came out called A Universe from Nothing. It was written by Lawrence Krauss. He was one of the guys who was a narrator. You might have known that I mentioned on that Time Lapse of the Future, that documentary that's been seen by 85 million people. Now, Lawrence Krauss, with that book, A Universe from Nothing, well, I was quite interested to hear what his arguments were, or rather read them. So I bought the book and I read the book. And look, I guess, unfortunately for Lawrence Krauss, he didn't actually demonstrate the universe came from nowhere. What he said was that initially there were the laws of physics, and there was an energetic quantum space. So in other words, you had energy and you had the laws of physics, and then just simply what you do is you convert the energy into the material world that we have. But it's not a universe from nothing, it's actually a universe from the laws of physics and from energy to start with. It's a nice theoretical construct, but it doesn't answer the question. And critics have pointed this out. It doesn't answer the question. And that's about the best attempt there is out there. In fact, Richard Dawkins, the very famous atheist who is very strong in his atheism, he actually said about Lawrence Krauss's book, he said, "This is the most important work since Charles Darwin's Origin of Species." Because it answers this question of universe for nothing, but it does nothing of the sort. So that's the problem. You really can't get a universe from nothing. And this is a real problem for evolutionists to actually come up with any explanation of how you can get a universe from nothing, because you can't explain it in any way that makes any sense. So then you've got the idea of an intelligence. And I would argue it's much more plausible to say there's an intelligent mind or God who brought the universe into existence than that it came from nothing, which actually makes no sense at all. But then to this question about who created God. Well, the first thing is no one ever talks about a created God. The thing is that God, by definition, is an eternal, timeless being who brings other things into existence, but was not caused himself. Now, some people may say, well, hang on a minute, isn't that a contradiction? Well, no, it's not. When you look at, even from the discipline of philosophy, and you look at logic and argumentation, it's perfectly reasonable. Within philosophy, you have something called the first mover, or the prime mover. So basically, the uncaused cause. And that's fine. There's nothing illogical or contradictory about having an eternal, timeless being who then, of their free will and choice, brought the rest of the universe, or brought the universe into being, brought the material world into being, and then brought other mind or consciousness into being. And so the question of who created God, look, while on the surface it seems an interesting question, it's not a question that poses any difficulty because by definition, God is the eternal, timeless being who brought everything else into being. So I hope that addresses that question. The next one, pain, suffering and evil in the world. That's a huge one. In fact, that's very commonly used. But I'm going to actually tip it round the other way. Because very often believers seem to think that they are the only ones that have to be on the defensive about this question. And they think, oh no, look, I've got to come up with some question. I've got to come up with an answer to this question because, look, if I don't, then, God's going to look bad and I've got to defend God, etc., etc. You know what? And so believers feel somehow under pressure, not recognising that everybody else has to come up with their own answer to the problem and come up with a better answer if they're going to try to disparage Christianity. See, every philosophy and religion in the world has to deal with this question, has to deal with this issue. So how do the others go? Well, let's say atheism. Atheism, which attacks Christianity, what answer does atheism have to the problem of suffering and evil? Well, it doesn't have any problem. There's no problem at all there to start with. Because by its very nature, evolution says that it's survival of the fittest. So it's dog eat dog within nature. The strong will survive. The weak is bound to have to suffer and many times suffer painful deaths. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way it is. And I could quote you Richard Dawkins and other atheists who say essentially the same thing. So atheism has no satisfactory solution to the problem of suffering and evil. In fact, it says it's the normal thing that you would expect. I find that hardly satisfying and giving me any particular good answer about suffering and evil. On the other hand, look, we could look at other philosophies and religions, and we don't really have time to do that. But look, if we looked at Eastern religions, for example, we've got karma and the idea that, you suffer for whatever you did wrong in this life. In the next life, when you come back, you've got to go through the process of suffering for what you've done in the past. And the problem there is, and this is a problem in countries who adopt this religious idea, is that there is an absence of progress of maybe humanitarian aid, of maybe medical aid. In fact, there's a resistance because the idea is if someone is born with a birth defect, or in actual fact, if they suffer violence or trauma, abuse, whatever bad happens in someone's life, you shouldn't intervene. Because they've got to suffer through their come. They've got to suffer for this life, in this life, for something they've done in the past. And if you intervene, then you're disrupting the normal cycle of things. So there again, it's not a very satisfactory answer to the problem of suffering and evil. Whereas the Christian faith is saying, well, God created people to be in for relationship with Him. Humans rebelled. God is a God of love, and so He didn't create robots. He wanted people to genuinely love Him. But to have genuine love, you've got to have the possibility of rejection. You've got to have the possibility where people don't do the ideal things and don't do the thing which is best for them. And this is what happened. That suffering and evil in this world happened because of choices that humans have made. Initially, Adam and Eve, but then humans as we've gone down the line. First of all, the fall, as we have it in Christian understanding, that when sin first entered, it caused a problem in the natural order of things. So now we have natural disasters, be it earthquakes, tsunamis, etc. But on the other hand, we've actually got people who do things, they make decisions that hurt other people. And so the pain and the suffering we have is as a result of things that have happened as a result of sin that's entered the world. But you know what? If it was left at that, you think that's really bad. But God has a plan. It's not as if we've been left to ourselves. God loved us so much that Jesus came to earth. He took our penalty, and because of Him, God is able to turn everything around. We know there's a future when Jesus is coming again. There's a new heavens, there's a new earth, and there is an eternity for everybody who was with God on that. I mean, you compare that with atheism. You compare that with, other religions. Christianity acknowledges the problem, but has the best solution to the problem of suffering and evil that there is out there. So Christians don't have to be on the defensive about this question. I would argue that Christians actually have an answer that is good news to everybody who is going through suffering and evil, and that includes all of us to some extent, to one extent or another. So look, many people will say that suffering and evil is an argument against God. I would argue that rightly understood, it actually can make the idea of God more attractive and more compelling. All right. Now, how have we got? We've got some of the ones for. Now, does anyone, I don't know if we've got the roving mic, is there anyone who wants to make any comment on any of the against before we move on to the four arguments? Okay, Gavin. Oh, good. Yeah, I can hear. I hope everyone...
It's interesting that those that don't believe in God would say that pain, suffering and evil is normal. There is no God, so that's normal. And Christians say, well, that God is love, and it's the rejection of God that also leads to pain, suffering, and evil. Mm-hmm. God sends His Son into the world, and everything He touched reversed pain, reversed suffering, and reversed evil. And what did men do? They killed Him, which is a reflection of our heart, not God's heart. So it's just an interesting...
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, that's what Jesus did. When He came to earth, he was relieving the burden of suffering and evil. What was he doing? He was healing, He was feeding, He was teaching. He was talking about a new kingdom. And the new kingdom, the kingdom of God. And how many of the parables He would start? The kingdom of God is like. And so, in every case, it was something which is marvellous and something which was wonderful. So Jesus came to bring us a fabulous message of reconciliation and restoration. So thank you. All right. Well, look. Now having dealt with, I guess, the two objections that were raised, let's go through and we can race through some of these four. So I think some of these are very. In fact, I think they're all. You guys have come up with a great. A great list there. So let's have a look at the first one, the complexity of the human body design. Look, I agree. Look, I remember now. Look, one of the things now. Probably many of you don't know too much about me. And that's okay. I wear several hats, but one of them that I wear is I'm a medical doctor and I practice on the Gold Coast. And I remember I was working in a particular surgery some years ago, and you know how there is, and if you've ever seen them, sometimes there is a diagram of the human body, and it shows the different organ systems. So you have the nervous system with the brain and the spinal cord. You've got the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the liver, et cetera, and you've got it there on the wall. And one time, the owner of the practice came in, and so when he came in, I just stared at the chart there of all the different body systems, and he said to me after a while, "What are you looking at? What are you staring at?" I said, "Look at that. There's a diagram there of the human body, and all the different organ systems," and he said, "Yeah, and." So what's so surprising about that? I said, can you believe there are people who look at that and they think it happened by accident? It happened by chance. It just happened. Can you believe that? And I think he looked at me a little bit strangely, and then he looked again at the chart, and then he said, "Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I see what you mean." And I don't know. I think maybe so often we're caught up. Well, not us particularly, but say people at school, at university. It's just assumed that it all happened by chance. We don't actually look and just see. Well, come on, really? We really think this happened by chance? We look at the complexity. Something as simple as blood clotting. You don't think about blood clotting unless you clot too much or too little. You clot too much, you have heart attacks and strokes. They're not good. You clot not enough, what happens? You cut yourself, you bleed to death, haemophilia, or some sort of other disorder. I mean, it's pretty finely tuned. Now, what we don't think about is the fact that there are 16 different proteins that they all have to be present at the same place, at the same time, in the right concentrations. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. You're going to clot too much, or you're going to bleed to death. Now, where does that come through? You take one of the 16 out, the whole system doesn't work. Where do all 16 come from, and how do they all somehow evolve at the one time? Now, That's just one example. We can look at the eye, we can look at the immune system, we can look at any organ system. We could just go on and on about the complexity of the human body. And recognizing that evolution says there is no purpose, there is no destination, it is a random accumulation of mutations, and somehow we get more complex. The problem is mutations don't add information. Mutations take away information. We've known that for a long period of time. There was a scientist by the name of John Sanford from Cornell University, and he looked at, he published hundreds of papers, but he looked at population genetics. He looked at mutations. He looked at mutations in populations over time. And what he concluded was, sorry guys, we're deteriorating. There's no way we're getting better. As the generations go by, our DNA is getting worse. In fact, he said it so significantly. He said, look, the way that humans are going, that in a few generations, as it is, we're getting more and more infertility, saying in a few generations, unless we do something, to intervene, we're going to have a real problem as a human species. Interestingly, he also took it back the other way. He said that if at our current rate of degradation of the DNA, the deterioration, he says we can't push it back much more than 10,000 years ago, because that's basically as far as we can push it in terms of going back at the current rates of deterioration. Otherwise, we wouldn't be fertile at all. It's interesting. It's just, a little snippet, which I think is fascinating. But there's a lot of things we could say about the complexity of the human body. But I think what is very clear, that design is something that just stares us in the face. We spend, billions and billions of dollars on medical research to try to improve things, and you know what? We're not improving on what nature itself was, and it clearly points to design. The interesting guy by the name of James Tour, I had a chance of meeting him some years ago. Now, James Tour is one of the top scientists in the world. He's into nanotechnology, and he builds molecules. He's got over 70 patents. He's got hundreds of peer-reviewed journal articles. He was rated in the top 50 scientists in the world in the year 2014 by R&D magazine. And there's another magazine or journal, I think it was a year or two earlier, rated him as a top scientist in the world. This is a guy with credibility. And it's interesting, you can watch him on YouTube. He is very strong on this whole business of design. He basically says, look, I design molecules for a living. That's what I do. I build stuff in material science and nanotechnology. And anyone who thinks that it's an easy thing to do has no idea what they're talking about. Anyone who thinks that it could have just happened by random chance has no idea about how the science actually works. It's just phenomenal. And this guy is a very strong believer, and he's a very strong communicator of the fact that this all points to God as a designer, that this is not something that could have ever happened by itself. All right. Origin of life. Origin of life is a fascinating one. I love the topic. The problem with the origin of life for evolutionists is that there is no plausible mechanism by which it could have happened. And this is it. Despite how many decades of research into this, there are many theories, but the evidence is not there about how it happened. And many of the evolutionists themselves will say, we've got a real problem when it comes to origin of life. We don't know how it happened. Now, you'll read the textbooks. Now, look, even just last year, I had a look at a high school biology textbook, and also there's some university textbooks. Now, what do they say about the origin of life? Because surely, if you're arguing for evolution, you've got to have some ideas about the origin of life. Well, while there are many theories, it mostly comes back to one particular theory, of which now there are variations. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, there were these scientific experiments done in a laboratory. They're called the Miller-Urey experiments. Now, I don't know, has anyone heard of those who's studied biology? You'll often read about them in the biology textbooks. And the idea was this. They put in some glass containers, they put some basic building blocks of life, things like methane or ammonia, things they assumed might have been present at the very beginning on the earth. Because what they assumed was that there was an earth. Now, where the earth came from, look, that's a totally different question. Look, remember we already talked about the origin of the universe. So let's assume the universe came from somewhere, or from nothing, as they say, and we've got an earth. Now, the earth's got water all the way around it, and it's got an atmosphere with no oxygen. Okay, we've got to assume, okay, so that's the assumption. So then we have lightning strikes and it hits this stuff, and then you have reactions. And this is what they tried to do in laboratory. They had electrodes go into these flasks where they had these, different gases and substances, and they tried to see if they could cause reactions that caused building blocks of life. And you know what? When they did the experiment, they found that, yeah, sure enough, they found some amino acids. Now, what's the significance of amino acids? Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So typically, let's say you took a typical protein chain and it would have 400 amino acids, some shorter, some longer, but you need to have these building blocks. But it's not like a bead. Each of these amino acids has three-dimensional structure. So it means that even if you have one of them out of order that's incorrect, then it gives you a different shape. It means it doesn't do the function. So when it comes to a protein chain, it has to have hundreds of amino acids all in the right order. If one of them's out of order, it doesn't work. Well, but anyway, the idea was they did the experiment and they got some amino acids. And out of that they said, wonderful, we have discovered the mystery of life. We have discovered how life could have happened on Earth. We obviously had the oceans, we had the lightning strikes, we formed amino acids, they formed together into protein chains, and then, then we had a cell membrane. I guess we had to have a cell membrane, otherwise they would swim away. So where did that come from? Okay, different question. And then, of course, we need DNA, because without DNA we can't reproduce, and it's no point. Where did that come from? Well, it's a different question. But anyway, we've got protein chains. Okay, well, all right, good. Well, protein chains. But can we get protein chains this way? See, there are several problems, and very soon they discovered there were problems. The first problem is that, you have these lightning strikes and you're going to have a lot of tar. You can imagine it. You've got this stuff and you have the lightning and it's a mess. It's a black stuff. And, how do you form life when you've got all black stuff everywhere? Really difficult. Next thing is they assumed there was no oxygen. Now, how do you assume that? Well, not that anyone was there so-called to see anything, but if oxygen was there, it couldn't happen. So because this is the way it had to happen, well, there couldn't have been any oxygen. Well, is that circular reasoning? Well, yes, I think so. But anyway, we know supposedly there was no oxygen because otherwise it couldn't have happened. The next thing is that this reaction of forming amino acids into proteins is a reversible reaction. What it means is, look, you can join them, but at the same time they can go apart. Can you imagine that? 400 chains in a row, and you got 399 together, but then they come apart. Well, look, I would argue that they come apart much more easily, simply because in water, it's more likely they're going to go apart than together. So we've got a real problem trying to get 400 of these together. It's just not going to happen. But that's not the worst of the problems. Then we've got the problem of you have left-handed and right-handed amino acids. Now, they have the same atoms, but because of their arrangement, they can be left or right-handed. Now, if you've got a random mixture because you've thrown lightning at it, well, guess what? You're going to have 50%, half of it's going to be left-handed, and 50%, half of it's going to be right-handed, because it's just random how you're going to produce those amino acids. But the problem is this, that in biologically active systems, so if you're trying to produce life, the only ones you can have in a protein chain are left-handed amino acids. You could have 400 left-handed in a row. You have one right-handed one in there at all, the thing doesn't work. What are the probabilities there? Actually, Daniel, you worked it out. We did that the other day. We worked it out. Somewhere on my phone. Anyway, but the probability of even doing that with just having 400 left-handed ones in a row is less chance than all the atoms in the known universe. It's just incredible. That's, the probability is just insanely low. It's impossible. But here you've got the next thing. Now, that's just left and right-handed. But let's say that you had a random mixture of 20 amino acids. Let's say you had lots of them. And let's say you randomly were going to put them together and get 400 in a row in the right sequence. Now, you can do the probabilities. Look, I know some people love math, some people hate it, and it's okay. And I'm not going to ask who is who in which category. But the point is, someone has done the figures. And if you've got 400 amino acids all in the right order, it's 10 to the power of minus 450. That's like a 10 with 450 zeros, one chance with 10 with all those zeros. Now, that's a number that's incomprehensible. If we were to put a bit of paper on the floor and then have A4 pages all the way to the moon, it'd be 10 with 12 zeros afterwards. If we looked at all the sand in the world, let's say all the sand on the beaches, on the deserts in the world, it'd be 10 to the 19th power. If we looked at all the atoms in the known universe, we'd be looking 10 to the power of 80. Here we're talking about 10 to the power of 1 to 10 to the power of 10 to the 450 to even produce one protein chain. Look, what that tells us, and even if we look at all the events in evolutionary history in the whole universe, it's only 10 to the 122, even if we give them 30 billion years. What it's telling us, in all the time of evolutionary time, there has not been, even by probability, not even one protein chain should ever have even happened. But then we've got the problem. We've got one protein chain, but then you need hundreds to have the simpler cell. Let's say you have hundreds of protein chains, but the problem is there's no point having one here, one 10 light years away, a million years into the future. Make sense? They've all got to be there in the same point in time. And then you've got to have a cell membrane so they don't swim away, and then you've got to produce DNA at the same time by a mechanism we have no idea. What it's basically telling us is that it is impossible that life could have developed spontaneously, which actually makes perfect sense when we look at the universe. And in fact, I hate to say this, sorry Dan, no reflection on you, but when you look at teenagers' bedrooms, they don't spontaneously get more ordered. You know, the life in the universe, I mean, you buy a new car and after 15 years it's not better than when you bought it, okay? The point is, the world around us, unless we put effort and energy into it, things run down, they don't get better. It's actually called the second law of thermodynamics. Now, here we somehow, look, the plain common sense view, we just look at things, we don't have cells come from non-cells. We don't then get more complexity. We have a real problem with the origin of life. The origin of life is something which I would argue is something that is impossible to have happened just by random chance. To me, it points very strongly to the fact there must have been a creator that brought it all into being. And then we've got the next, I'm looking at the time. Anyway, don't mind me. I get excited about this and I'll get carried away. But I'll make this point because it's one thing, and let's say the origin of life. Let's say that you get a cell. All right, you've got a cell. What use is a cell? We're here. Look at the complexity of the human body. How do we get from a single cell in an ocean to somehow like us? Well, you know what? How are we told? What are we told in the biology textbooks? It happened by mutations. What's mutations? Mutations are when the DNA is copied and then you get the new cell or the new organism, and it's from mistakes. Now, come on, let's just look at this from a common sense point of view. You have something that you copy, and when you make mistakes, it gets better. Well, hang on, let's say that you have, now I know that, look, this illustration doesn't really work now because, look, digital is a bit different. But you remember the old days when we had CDs. Better still the cassette tapes, if you remember those days. But let's say that you had a CD and you burnt, well, let's say you burnt a song on there. Let's say then that you made a copy of that onto someone. Do you think the copy is going to be better than the original? Okay, let's say you make a copy and then a copy of that copy and a copy of that copy, and you do it 100 times down the line. Do you reckon the 100th copy is going to be better than the original? Well, that's what evolutionary science is telling us, is how we went from a simple cell to a complex human being over millions of years. It's as if, give it enough time and it's going to happen. Well, hang on. Give it more time and it's going to deteriorate more. It's not going to get better and better the more. Time doesn't solve anything. You know, it's almost as if it's a secret ingredient. You know, throw in more time, we're going to fix it. Well, hang on. No, something's got to happen during that time, and something that is scientifically logical and plausible. But this is a problem. You can have the first cell develops, but then how on earth do you get to a complex human being? I would argue impossible. And I would argue that the science is arguing the exact opposite, which is exactly what, remember the professor I talked about from Cornell, the population geneticist. What he was saying was that as we are reproducing, we're introducing more errors, we're actually losing information, we're not gaining more information, we're not gaining more complexity. So I think the origin of life, in many ways, is a huge argument for the existence of God, because it's the only way that makes sense that we're here. Nature and way they act. Yeah, look, we've kind of covered a little bit, but look, I mean, certainly we can talk about ecological systems. We can talk about the fact, in fact, I would even take it, look, let me take this one in an interesting way, the fine-tuning of the universe. So not just even nature in terms of plants and animals, but what about the universe itself? What we know is that there are physical constants. You've probably heard of like the speed of light. That's a physical constant. And the point is that if it changes even a little bit, it throws everything else out. Now, but there are dozens and dozens of these constants. Now, one of the ones that I thought was fascinating was there's an electromagnetic force constant and there's a gravitational force constant. Now, the ratio between those has to be exact. Even if it changes in one part in 10 with 40 zeros afterwards, life could not exist in the universe. That's how precise it is. Now, you remember those numbers, 10 to the 12 was papers to the moon, 10 to the 19 was sand on Earth. Well, what's this number 10 to the 40? Because that's how precise just two of the constants have to be, the ratio between them. How big a number is that? Well, let's imagine that the entire Earth is made of grains of sand. It's a lot of grains of sand, isn't it? But then let's just say it's not just one Earth. Let's say we've got 1 billion Earths, all made of tiny grains of sand. What this number is telling us, that if you took 1 grain of sand away, or you added 1 more grain of sand to that billion Earths made of sand, then you couldn't have life existing on Earth. That's how precise that is between those two ratios of the electromagnetic force constant and the gravitational force constant. And that's just an example of two of them. There are dozens of these. And it's incomprehensible, the fine-tuning that there is. In fact, a lot of physicists have looked at it and say, this is crazy. This could not have happened by chance. And do you know what the solution is? If you don't want to believe in God, do you know what the theory is out there? The theory is called the multiverse theory. And that is the idea, look, we recognise that it's incredibly precise and, look, it seems crazy it could ever happen in one universe. So instead of admitting, well, look, hey, maybe this points to God, rather it's, well, look, if we imagine that there are an infinite number of universes out there, called the multiverse, then you know what? Somewhere there must be a universe that has exactly the right conditions for life. The problem with that is that, well, first of all, there's no evidence of any universe apart from this universe. But the second problem is that we have enough problems explaining one universe that came out of nothing. How are you going to now explain an infinite number of universes that came out of nothing? You haven't simplified the problem. You've magnified it an infinite number of times. So I don't think the multiverse is satisfactory at all. It makes much more sense when you look at this that there was a designer who made this universe and made this earth specially designed so that humans could actually inhabit this earth. It points very clearly to God, as I would see it. All right, now we go. Oh, look at the time. I always like racing the clock. All right, we've got it. Okay, Bible. I'm not going to say too much about Bible prophecy because I think a lot of people are quite familiar with Bible prophecy. There are 3 major types of Bible prophecy. There are the messianic prophecies, which are Old Testament prophecies that point to Jesus Christ as the Messiah. You look at ones like Micah chapter 5, verse 2, where it talks about coming from Bethlehem of Judah, who comes from old, from everlasting. It's talking about someone who is from before the existence of the earth. That's not something. That's something supernatural. Something amazing. You've got other messianic prophecies that talk about, the 30 pieces of silver that, were given, about the fact that, his arms and legs hands and feet were pierced. There were the prophecies in Daniel 9 which talk about the 70 weeks, and it points forward to actually the time when Jesus was actually came to earth, pointing, back. So you've got the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9. There are so many. Some people have said that there may be over 50, some even say up to 200 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. And these weren't written after the time of Jesus Christ. Very clearly, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and they point to these manuscripts in existence at least 100 to 200 years before the time of Jesus Christ. That's where we can come into some of the archaeological things and the discoveries, because the manuscripts show that this is the case. Then we have other prophecies which are places and be it cities or countries, Babylon, you've got Egypt, Tyre, Sidon, there's a lot of these places where there's specific prophecies in the Old Testament that came to pass. And then, of course, you've got the prophecies which we call apocalyptic in Daniel and Revelation. And so not to go into it too much, but, many of us are familiar with prophecies in Daniel 2, in 7, 8, 9, prophecies in the book of Revelation. And so, the church runs, seminars on prophecy seminars, Revelation seminars, etc. So many people will look at those and say, yeah, clearly there's a supernatural element. There's God must exist, for the prophecy that we can clearly see there. All right, the next one is complexity and diversity and likeness. Look, I think we've kind of covered that in some of the biological stuff I've gone through before. Then we've got identity and resurrection of Jesus. I'm going to finish up on that one because I think that's a brilliant one. But look, the last one before we go to the second last is evidence for the Bible. We've spoken a bit about evidence for the Bible, but look, let's have a look. One of the things I like is particularly when you look at, we've mentioned Dead Sea Scrolls for the Old Testament, but you've got the evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. Many people will argue, the New Testament, that's written 2,000 years ago, how can it possibly be reliable? Well, but the problem is people might disparage it, but then you ask them the question, well, can you tell me what criteria you use in order to judge whether a document is reliable or not? Because people get away with saying a lot of stuff without actually backing it up. So someone can, they can laugh at the New Testament if they want to, but on what basis? Let them come up with reasons why they think it's unreliable. The point is, we can use criteria to evaluate the New Testament in any piece of ancient literature. So, what does it claim to be? Look, does it claim to be a work of history, telling the truth about Jesus Christ, as in the New Testament, or is it a work of fiction? Well, no, it's not. Was it written by eyewitnesses or people who heard something from someone else? Well, obviously, eyewitness testimony is something very powerful. When was it written, and when were the early manuscripts that we have? See, if you've got manuscripts that are 1,000 years removed from when it was originally written, well, there's some uncertainty about how reliable that is. But if, in the case of the New Testament, you've got fragments from within a generation and major manuscripts are within 100 to 200 years, that is so much better than most of ancient literature, where in many cases it's 1,000 years or more. But no one questions the ones that are 1,000 years or more, but people are happy to question the New Testament that has much stronger evidence. What about numbers of manuscripts? Most ancient manuscripts, there's just a handful. There might be a dozen, there might be 2 dozen if you're lucky. The New Testament has thousands of Greek or Latin or early manuscripts that are much earlier than others. Then, of course, we've got the archaeological and we've got the historical evidence. We've got other people who support what is in the Bible. You've got Roman historians such as Tacitus who speak about Jesus Christ, clearly establishing he was a person of history. You've got Josephus, who again establishes Jesus Christ and tells us much of what was happening around the time of the early Christian church, and multiple other historians. Those of you who have travelled in the Bible lands and in Greece and in Rome and places, you can see places there that are clearly identified in the New Testament. And as people look into the manuscripts more and more, they're finding they're increasingly reliable. See, the critics would look at the Bible and say, it's not reliable. But as more and more discoveries have happened, they found actually the Bible is reliable, and those critics were wrong, whatever they said 50 or 100 years ago. So certainly evidence for the Bible is growing very strongly. And then the final one is identity and resurrection of Jesus. See, many people will accept that Jesus was a good man and he was a good teacher. Okay, that's fine. But you know what? He made the claim that he's God. I won't go through the passages, but you can look in John chapter 8, John chapter 10, before Abraham was, I am, and, the Father and I are one. But so what happened? The Jewish authorities wanted to kill Jesus not because of good works, they said, but because he, a man, was claiming to be God. There's no question that Jesus claimed to be God. But the point is, what do you do with someone who claims to be God? Very often we find them in psychiatric institutions because they're a danger to themselves or to other people. But here, we can't apply that to Jesus Christ. See, if someone claims to be God, they're either telling the truth or they're not telling the truth. Okay? If they're not telling the truth, they either know they're not telling the truth or they don't know they're telling the truth. If they know if they know they're not telling the truth, then they're trying to deceive you. They're trying to be a con man, right? If they don't know it, well, there's obviously something wrong. Psychiatrically, they're crazy. Someone claiming to be God and they think they are, but they're not really. Well, there's something wrong with their mind. But this is it. If, Jesus claimed as he claimed to be God, if, can you say he's a madman? Well, look, as the point was made, he's had a bigger influence on history than anybody else. Time magazine at the turn of the millennium called him the person of history, the most influential person in history. There's been more books written about him than any person in history. He's had more influence on every major discipline of academic inquiry than any other person. We can thank hospitals in the way that we have them now, thanks to Jesus Christ, the educational institutions, the universities, the social welfare systems. All of this goes back to the teaching of Jesus Christ. Somebody you cannot possibly say was a madman. It just doesn't make sense. Was he a con man? Well, no. I mean, look, first of all, to be a con man, there were the messianic prophecies we spoke about. And they talk about where he was born, which tribe, with the city, that he would die by a particular method. Well, you know what con man is going to look at that and say, well, look, that's for me. No, you're going to run. By the time you understand the messianic prophecies, no, thanks very much. I'm not going to try to be the con man over that. Doesn't make sense. We're left with the possibility that Jesus actually was telling the truth when he claimed to be God. And look, when you look at history, when you look at all the other evidence, it makes perfect sense. But particularly on the final point, I'll talk about the resurrection of Jesus. And I've got a whole sermon on this. One day, look, if I ever get invited back, I'd love to share that. But look, when you look at the evidence for the resurrection, it is overwhelming. Many critics have tried to disprove the resurrection. But the problem is that when you look objectively at it, there are certain historical facts that you cannot explain in the other way. See, most scholars will agree with 4 facts. Whether they're believers or not believers, there's 4 historical facts. The first one is that Jesus was a real person of history and he died by crucifixion. Now, the crucifixion part, Josephus actually speaks about that. So look, we've got external evidence outside of the New Testament, but why do you need evidence outside the New Testament when the New Testament's the most reliable piece of ancient literature that we have? But that's a different story. So, the second point is that the disciples of Jesus clearly believed that Jesus rose from the dead and they preached that. There's no question about it either. The third point is there was an empty tomb. Now, and that was admitted by the Jewish authorities as well as the Romans and, of course, the believers. But then the fourth one, I think, is critical, and that is that Christianity, when Jesus died, it looked like it was all over. It looked like it was a failure. But what happened? Within a few short years, Christianity had spread through the whole empire. It had turned the world upside down. And this is despite the fact that its message of the resurrection was considered crazy, because the ancient world didn't understand the resurrection. They thought that the whole idea was preposterous. So it was persecuted. So the whole idea of why would you have something turn the world upside down when everybody seemed opposed to it, particularly if Jesus was dead and he was in the grave. But then you have another point. Christianity was saying we need to worship as God somebody who actually died on a cross. And the idea of dying on a cross was crazy. It was like, the cross was for the worst of the worst. So if someone was to die on a cross, that was the end. Shame. What are we doing? We're going to worship somebody who died on a cross? This is just so countercultural that it's unimaginable. But despite all of this, you have a belief that Jesus actually rose, a message that he rose from the dead, and it spread through the empire such that within hundreds of years, it's almost as if the whole empire had converted to Christianity. There is only one explanation for that, and that is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Because if he didn't rise from the dead, the historical facts don't make sense. So many people have looked at it and they've concluded, hey, Jesus actually did rise from the dead. And if Jesus rose from the dead, it supports his claims that he was God. And then, we've established the whole trustworthiness and the great message that Jesus has for us. I've got to say, look at that. I'll get beaten by the clock. Sorry, I've gone a few minutes over time, but I hope you can see my passion for it. You guys have done a great job in coming up with some great arguments for and against ones. I hope in the brief time that we've spent, you found some of the arguments convincing. I hope encouraging in your own faith. But also, I hope you've kind of got what I hope is a perspective that we've got a great message to share as Christians. We've got something that is full of hope. It's full of a wonderful future for a world that is otherwise, in many ways pessimistic without the hope that we have. So I wish you all the very best. God bless you all, and look forward to catching up with you perhaps another time. Thank you, Adam.